Reid's mornings generally unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a metronome. The same lukewarm coffee, the same news updates chattering from a forgotten corner of the kitchen, the same gray light filtering through his apartment window. His work as a cartographer, meticulous and precise, mirrored the quiet, ordered existence he had cultivated. He charted known territories, defined boundaries, and rarely ventured beyond the lines he drew. It was a life of control, of certainty, and lately, of a creeping, undefined stagnation. One Tuesday, however, the metronome skipped a beat. A heavy, cream-colored envelope, unlike the usual bills or junk mail, lay nestled in his mailbox. It bore no return address, only a stark, typewritten block, Reid Vance. Inside, a single sheet of thick parchment and a business card. The card belonged to a solicitor, a name he didn't recognize, from an office he'd never heard of. The letter, brief and formal, informed him of the sudden, mysterious death of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara Vance, whom Reid barely remembered. A name like a whisper from another lifetime, attached to a face he couldn't quite conjure. The letter concluded with an instruction. Reid was to attend a meeting regarding his estate at a specific location, a remote monastery, nestled deep within the old forest lands, 3 days hence. A remote monastery. The words hung in the air, foreign and unsettling. Reid frowned, running a thumb over the raised lettering of the solicitor's card. Why there? His great-aunt, he vaguely recalled, had been something of an eccentric, a recluse even in her youth. The details of her life were sparse, whispers and vague warnings from older family members who spoke of her with a mix of pity and apprehension. This inheritance, whatever it was, felt less like a windfall and more like a summons. Despite the prickle of unease, a flicker of something akin to curiosity, or perhaps a desire for a break in the monotony, stirred within him. He was determined to see this through, to understand what legacy this forgotten relative had left behind. The journey began under a sky the color of bruised plums, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. His old sedan ate up the miles, the familiar hum of the engine a dwindling comfort as the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills, then to dense, ancient woodland. The paved road soon dissolved into a gravel track, then a barely maintained dirt path, swallowed by overarching boughs that clawed at the sky. After hours of driving, the path finally opened into a clearing, revealing the monastery. No grand spires or ornate carvings, just a stoic, brutalist architecture that seemed to rise organically from the bedrock. Small, arched windows stared out like blind eyes. A single, heavy oak door, studded with iron, stood as the only obvious entrance. An unnatural stillness permeated the grounds, as if sound itself had been absorbed by the thick walls and the surrounding forest. Inside, the monastery was dim and cool, the stone floors echoing with each step. A robed figure, a man with a surprisingly gentle face and eyes that held centuries of quiet observation, directed him to a small, Spartan meeting room. The solicitor was already there, a sharp-suited man with thinning hair and a briefcase clutched like a lifeline. He introduced himself as Mr. Thorne. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Thorne began, his voice dry and formal, "thank you for making the journey. Your great-aunt, Elara Vance, passed away 3 weeks ago. Her death was unexpected." He paused, glancing around the stark room as if expecting an interruption. "He designated you as the sole inheritor of his property, a cabin, and the land surrounding it, deep within these very woods." Reid felt a strange jolt. A cabin. Not a fortune, not a grand estate, but a cabin. "Where exactly is it?" he asked, a touch of skepticism in his voice. Mr. Thorne pushed a folded, yellowed map across the table. His finger, surprisingly unsteady, traced a winding, almost invisible line deep into the green expanse. Here. It's quite secluded. Your great-aunt was particular about her privacy. He cleared his throat. There are some rumors, local superstitions, about the area. Old burial grounds, that sort of thing. Nothing credible, of course. But the solicitor's eyes darted away, betraying a flicker of unease. He handed Reid a heavy, tarnished brass key in a small, leather-bound journal. These were found among her effects here at the monastery. His final request was that you receive them in person. The journal felt strangely warm in Reid's hand, its cover smooth from years of handling. He could almost feel a faint thrum against his palm. The drive from the monastery to the cabin was even more arduous. The map, hand-drawn and faded, led him down trails that were less paths and more suggestions of passage. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old iron. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, seemed too loud, too deliberate. Finally, the trees parted just enough to reveal it, the cabin. It wasn't quaint or charming. It was a hulking, skeletal thing, built of rough-hewn logs that had long since surrendered their bark to the elements, turning a deep, somber gray. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, and the windows, small and irregular, were mostly boarded over, giving it the appearance of a blind, ancient beast hunkered down in the undergrowth. A crooked stone chimney leaned precariously. There was no garden, no path, just the cabin rising directly from a tangle of briars and weeds. He felt a profound sense of isolation here, deeper than anything he'd ever known. As he approached the warped front door, the heavy brass key felt like a lead weight in his hand, and the low, guttural groan of the wind sighing through the eaves of the cabin sounded almost like a sigh of welcome. Or perhaps, a warning. The map, brittle and smelling faintly of mildew and forgotten attics, was less a guide and more a puzzle. It led Reid down logging roads that dissolved into overgrown tracks, then to a barely discernible path swallowed by ancient hemlocks. The cabin, when it finally emerged from the dense canopy, was a squat, timbered structure, weathered to the color of old bone. It seemed less built into the landscape and more grown from it, an organic extension of the forest floor. A profound stillness hung in the air, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. He pushed open the heavy oak door. It groaned a protest, a sound like a long-held sigh. Inside, the air was cold, thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy window panes. The furnishings were sparse, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth choked with cold ashes, and a narrow cot draped in a moth-eaten blanket. It was exactly as the relative's reclusive life had suggested, utterly devoid of modern comfort or even basic amenity. Reid spent the first few hours simply cleaning, sweeping away decades of neglect. He scrubbed at the windows, letting in more light, but the gloom persisted in the corners, clinging like cobwebs. As he moved through the small space, a faint scraping sound came from the loft above, a rhythmic, almost deliberate drag. He paused, broom held aloft, listening. Nothing. He shrugged, attributing it to a squirrel or the house settling. Old structures made noises. He knew that. Later, while attempting to light a fire in the hearth, a distinct thud echoed from the adjoining room, the cabin's only other chamber, presumably the bedroom. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Reid straightened, a prickle of unease tracing his spine. The room was empty, the cot undisturbed, the small, rickety dresser still standing. He frowned. He was alone here. Deep in the woods. The isolation was beginning to press in. He told himself it was just the wind, or the ancient timbers groaning under their own weight. He went back to the hearth, forcing himself to focus on the task. Soft taps on the windowpane, too irregular for rain, too light for branches. His determined practicality warred with a growing, unsettling awareness. He poured himself a cup of lukewarm water from his canteen, his hand brushing against something on the table. He looked down. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. He hadn't noticed it before. He was certain it hadn't been there when he'd cleaned the table earlier, its surface having been coated in a thick layer of dust. He picked it up, feeling the rough grain under his thumb. Had he knocked it from a shelf? Placed it there himself without thinking? He couldn't recall. The incident, minor as it was, lodged itself in his mind, a tiny burr of confusion. Sleep offered little respite. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, every distant hoot of an owl seemed amplified, distorted, imbued with a sinister intent. He awoke before dawn, feeling more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. The faint, sweet, metallic smell seemed stronger this morning, a sickly perfume clinging to the air. Determined to shake off the creeping unease, Reid decided to properly explore the cabin, to catalog its contents, to make it his own. He started in the bedroom, pulling out the dresser drawers, most of them empty or filled with moth-eaten scraps of fabric. He ran his hand along the wall beside the cot, searching for anything unusual. His fingers brushed against a loose knot in the timber. He pressed it, and with a soft click, a small section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dusty cavity. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves and cobwebs, was a heavy, leather-bound journal. Beside it lay a small, tarnished silver amulet, depicting a gnarled tree with roots that plunged deep into the earth. Reid pulled the journal out, its weight surprising. He opened it carefully. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the script was precise, almost calligraphic. The entries began decades ago, detailing mundane cabin life, but quickly veered into observations of the land, the forest, and then, slowly, into something far stranger. And then, a name began to appear with increasing frequency, a remote monastery. The entries spoke of journeys there, of seeking counsel from the keeper of old ways, of ancient texts and desperate requests. The relative, it seemed, had been grappling with far more than just solitude. Reid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's cold air. The seed of doubt, planted by the minor disturbances, now began to sprout, its roots digging deep into his resolve. The cabin, when it finally emerged from the dense canopy, was less a structure and more a scar. It squatted, a low, weathered thing of dark timber and moss-shrouded shingles, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy brows of eaves. A faint, cloying scent, damp earth mingled with something sharp, like old iron, hung in the air, a greeting Reid couldn't quite place. He stood for a long moment, the hum of the forest pressing in, the weight of the map still in his hand, feeling an inexplicable pull, a strange gravity that drew him towards the silent dwelling. He spent the first few days simply existing, trying to acclimate. The cabin was cold even in the afternoon sun, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very timbers. He attributed it to age, to disuse. The floorboards groaned, the wind moaned through ill-fitting frames, and the distant calls of unseen birds echoed with an unsettling clarity. He told himself it was just an old house settling, a product of his imagination working overtime in the isolation. He'd pause, straining his ears, the hair on his arms prickling, only to hear nothing but the rush of his own blood. He'd blame the wind, the creaks of ancient wood, the rustle of leaves against the glass. He'd turn on music, anything to drown out the phantom chorus. One evening, a thick fog had rolled in, pressing against the windows like a pale, eager face. A distinct thump echoed from upstairs, followed by a dragging sound, heavy and deliberate, like something being pulled across bare floorboards. He froze, his book slipping from his grasp. It wasn't a settling house, it was too rhythmic, too intentional. He called out, his voice thin in the sudden quiet, "Hello?" There was no answer, only the continued drag. Drag. Drag from above. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. Each step was an effort, his muscles screaming with tension. The dragging sound stopped as he reached the landing. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the empty spaces, finding nothing amiss. He felt a profound sense of violation, of being watched, assessed. The rationalizations, the attempts to explain it away, shattered like brittle glass. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't the wind. And whatever shared the space with him, it was not benign. The next morning, Reid began his research. He started with the internet, typing in the relative's name, the cabin's approximate location, keywords like ancient burial ground, forest legends. The search results were sparse, mostly property records and vague historical society entries that offered no real insight. He needed something more, something local, something old. He remembered a mention, buried deep in his relative's sparse papers, of a nearby remote monastery, known for its extensive archives and the longevity of its resident scholars. It was a long shot, but it was his only lead. The drive was arduous, winding through increasingly dense forest, then breaking out into a landscape of rolling hills before descending into a secluded valley. The monastery appeared suddenly, a formidable stone edifice rising from the mist-shrouded earth, its ancient walls covered in ivy, a solitary bell tower piercing the gray sky. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the soft scrape of his shoes on polished flagstones. An elderly archivist, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes keen and surprisingly alert, greeted Reid. He explained his predicament, the cabin, the family connection, the strange occurrences. The archivist listened, his expression unreadable, then led Reid through echoing corridors to a vast, dust-laden library. Reid spent hours poring over brittle documents, his fingers growing smudged with ancient dust. He found references to his distant relative, not just as the last owner, but as one in a long line of caretakers, a lineage stretching back further than he could have imagined. The deeds themselves were peculiar, describing the land not just by acreage but by specific natural features, naming ancient trees and rock formations as if they were sentient landmarks. Then he found it. A small, leather-bound journal, tucked away behind a bulky volume on local flora. It wasn't formally catalogued. The script inside was faded, elegant, and deeply unsettling. The price will be paid in full. There was a name, too, not his relative's. Another, far older family name, one that appeared sporadically in the land deeds, always connected to the cabin. Reid closed the journal, the smell of its decaying pages suddenly cloying, suffocating. The air in the library, once merely still, now felt heavy, charged with unspoken truths. He didn't need to ask the archivist what it meant. The fragments of information, disjointed yet terrifyingly coherent, clicked into place. They were manifestations of something ancient, something that had been contained, but was now stirring, demanding its due. And his arrival at the cabin, his unwitting inheritance, had just awoken it. Reid felt it coat the inside of his nose, a phantom taste on his tongue. He shivered, despite the warmth of the day, and pushed open the groan of the front door. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of dust and shadows. Sunlight struggled through the grime-coated panes, casting weak, shifting patterns on the uneven floorboards. He ran a hand over a rough-hewn table, leaving a clean streak in the accumulated grit. Every object felt imbued with a history he couldn't quite grasp, a silent witness to whatever had transpired within these walls. His gaze fell upon the stone hearth, a formidable structure dominating one wall. It looked out of place, too solid, too ancient for the relatively simple cabin. His fingers traced the rough mortar between the stones, feeling for any irregularity. It wasn't mortar, but a thin, almost invisible seam. He pushed, gently at first, then with more force. Inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed linen, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was scarred, its pages dog-eared and stained. Reid pulled it out, the linen crumbling in his hands. He settled onto a rickety stool, the journal heavy in his lap. The script inside was faded, spidery, and difficult to decipher, but the language was English, albeit an older, more formal style. The entries were dated, spanning decades, written by various hands. He skipped through the early, mundane entries, searching for anything unusual. Then he found it. Prosperity for 100 years, for the price of the firstborn's blood. The pact is made, witnessed by the ancient grove. The entity shall guard our fortunes, and claim its tithe. Reid's breath hitched. A pact? Blood? He flipped more pages, frantic now. Then, more recent entries, less coherent, filled with desperation and fear. It stirs. The time of reckoning approaches. The lineage weakens, the offerings forgotten. It seeks its master, its keeper. The bloodline is cursed. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a plea: only the sacred order, those who guard the ancient ways, can appease it. They remember the old truths. They know the price. The journal fell from Reid's trembling hands, clattering onto the floorboards. The entity wasn't a ghost, it was a consequence, a thing bound to the land by a grotesque agreement. His ancestors hadn't just built a cabin on an ancient burial ground, they had desecrated it, made a deal, and now the bill was coming due. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was a cage, a locus of a terrible, enduring hunger. And he, Reid, was part of the payment. He had to go. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the forest in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The journey would be long, dangerous, and the cabin, he knew, would be watching him leave. The entity was tied to the land, and by blood, so was he. The cloying scent followed him, a promise of what lay ahead, and what awaited his return. The journal lay splayed on the scarred pine floorboards,
its brittle pages whispering a truth far more terrible than any ghost story.
Reid stared at it, the words grotesque agreement and desecrated burning behind his eyes. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a consequence, a thing woven into the very fabric of this place, born of his ancestors' avarice and fear. The cabin, which had felt merely old and isolated, now pulsed with a malevolent, conscious energy, a living trap built on a foundation of betrayal. A cold, dry air, smelling of ancient dust and something metallic, seeped from the floorboards, chilling Reid's bare feet. He hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps it hadn't been there, not like this. The familiar creaks of settling would transformed into something more deliberate, like the heavy sigh of a slumbering beast. He could feel it now, the entity, no longer a vague presence but a watchful, predatory intelligence. It knew he knew. He snatched up the journal, clutching it like a shield, and stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the rough-hewn wall. The wood felt unnervingly soft, yielding slightly under his touch, as if the cabin itself was breathing. Reid lunged for the front door, his fingers fumbling for the iron latch. The metal was frigid, almost painful to touch, and it refused to budge. He twisted, pulled, then pushed with all his weight, but the door remained stubbornly shut, as if fused to the frame. He tried. Again, harder, his breath catching in his throat. A low, guttural groan seemed to emanate from the wood itself, vibrating up his arm. It wasn't the sound of old timber, it was a sound of deep, deliberate resistance. He spun around, his gaze darting to the windows. The glass, previously merely grimy, now appeared opaque, glazed with a viscous, swirling film that distorted the outside world into a blurred, sickly green. He pressed his palm against a pane. It was warm, almost feverish, and a faint, sticky residue clung to his skin. He recoiled, scrubbing his hand on his jeans. The cabin wasn't just holding him, it was actively changing, becoming an extension of the entity's will. A faint scratching began, a rhythmic rasping sound, emanating from the ceiling directly above him. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. It sounded like something enormous dragging claws across dry stone, or perhaps something trapped, desperate to get in or out. He looked up, his neck craning, but saw nothing but the usual rough ceiling beams. Yet the sound intensified, growing louder, closer, as if whatever made it was descending through the very wood. Then, a voice. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a cacophony of overlapping, distorted syllables, like 1,000 insects chittering in unison, each one trying to convey a different, horrifying message. The sound hammered at his sanity, trying to pry it loose. It spoke of sacrifice, of ancient debts, of a lineage stained by blood and broken promises. Reid stumbled back, tripping over a loose floorboard, and landed hard on his backside, the journal flying from his grip once more. He scrabbled backward on the floor, his eyes wide open, darting around the room, searching for an escape, a hidden door, anything. His gaze fell upon the open journal. One page, previously unnoticed, had been violently torn, leaving a ragged edge. Below the tear, a faint, almost invisible sketch of a building emerged, meticulously detailed despite its age. It was a sprawling, imposing structure, perched precariously on a jagged cliff face, overlooking what appeared to be a turbulent, gray sea. Intricate carvings adorned its facade, and a series of strange symbols, almost runic, were etched around its base. Beneath the sketch, in the same spider-thin script that detailed the pact, was a single, stark entry, the knowledge, the true bindings, kept safe within the stones of the remote monastery. Only there, where the old faith still holds its sway, can the ancient compact be understood, perhaps undone. It was an impossible journey, a desperate gamble, but it was a path. A way out. The floorboards beneath him groaned, a long, drawn-out sound, like a predator stretching. The entity knew his thoughts. It knew his intention. And it wouldn't let him leave. The cabin wasn't just a trap, it was a cage, and the keeper of the gates was already within. The cabin walls rippled, a subtle tremor that ran through the rough-hewn timbers, making the shadows in the corners writhe as if stirred by an unseen current. Reid's gaze snapped from the journal entry to the unsettling undulations, a prickle of dread crawling up his spine. The air, already thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, grew heavy, pressing down on him. The words, "remote monastery," were a lifeline, a desperate, terrifying hope, but the cabin itself seemed to mock his burgeoning resolve. It was alive, and it knew his intentions. He wouldn't be consumed. He wouldn't be another name in the grim ledger of this place. The remote monastery was his only path, however arduous. He needed his small pack, some food, the compass, and the tattered map he'd found in the glove compartment of his vehicle. As he reached for the pack slung over a chair, it wasn't there. A sharp jolt of unease shot through him. He'd left it right there. He spun, scanning the small room. His eyes snagged on it, perched impossibly on the highest shelf of a built-in cabinet, a place he couldn't have reached without a stool. He hadn't touched it since yesterday. He hadn't even looked at that shelf. This was a deliberate act. He pulled his hand back as if burned, examining his fingertips. Nothing. No residue, no visible moisture. Just the lingering sensation of something profoundly wrong. Gathering what little non-perishable food he had, a few energy bars and some dried fruit, he stuffed them into the pack. His water bottle, half full, sat on the counter. The water bottle was gone. This wasn't just resistance, it was an active obstruction. He grabbed another bottle, filled it from the hand pump, his movements jerky, frantic. Finally, pack secured, he gripped the crude wooden handle of the cabin door. It felt rough, splintered beneath his palm. Instead, a blast of cloying sweetness hit him, thick and sickly, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. The air was unnaturally still, devoid of the usual rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The path he'd always used, the faint deer trail that led to the old logging road, was gone. Erased. Reid stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy earth. He turned right, towards where the logging road should be, his compass clutched in his hand. The needle spun wildly, then settled, pointing stubbornly north. He checked his mental map. North led deeper into the wilderness, away from any semblance of civilization, away from the direction of the remote monastery. He tried again, turning, reorienting himself. The needle stubbornly pointed north, no matter which way he faced. It wasn't broken, it was simply refusing to cooperate, as if the cardinal directions themselves had been rearranged around him. A wave of dizzying disorientation washed over him. The trees seemed to lean in, their rough bark like ancient, scowling faces. He pushed forward, forcing himself to ignore the insistent rustling in the undergrowth that never quite resolved into a visible creature, the way the light shifted and flickered as if the sun itself was being toyed with. The sweet, cloying smell intensified, now tinged with something acrid, like burnt sugar. He kept expecting to break through, to see a familiar landmark, to hear the distant drone of a passing vehicle on a faraway road. But there was nothing. His legs burned, his lungs ached. His throat was dry, and he cursed the vanished water bottle. He pushed aside a curtain of tangled vines, hoping for a glimpse of something, anything, familiar. He froze. Before him, nestled in a small clearing, was his own cabin. Its chimney stood stark against the sky, a thin wisp of smoke curling lazily from its top, though he hadn't lit a fire. The door he had just exited stood slightly ajar. He had walked in a circle. Or rather, he had been made to walk in a circle. A raw, guttural cry tore from his throat. He stared at the cabin, then back at the impassive, mocking forest. It had thwarted him. It had played with him, like a cat with a mouse, letting him run just long enough to believe an escape before yanking his back to the starting line. The entity's power extended far beyond the cabin walls. It permeated the very earth, the air, the compass, his own senses. Each step was heavy, laden with the crushing weight of his failure. He was trapped. The remote monastery felt not just miles away, but dimensions away, an impossible dream and a reality that was rapidly unraveling around him. He sank onto the floor, his back against the cold stone hearth, his body trembling, his mind a fractured landscape of fear and disbelief. He was no longer just a resident, he was a plaything. And the game had only just begun. He tried to steady himself, to rationalize the impossible, but the cabin itself seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, monstrous rhythm. The rough-hewn timbers warped and twisted before his eyes, blurring the familiar lines of the room. The corners stretched into impossible angles, the ceiling seemed to recede, then press down, threatening to crush him. A profound disorientation seized him, a sickening lurch as if the very ground beneath him was tearing. The smell intensified, acrid and metallic, like old blood mixed with ozone. Then, with a final, wrenching twist, the cabin dissolved. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of ancient dust and forgotten incense, a stark contrast to the volatile chaos he had just left. Above him, a vaulted ceiling, stained with centuries of neglect, stretched into a gloom that swallowed the weak light filtering through narrow, grime-caked windows high overhead. This was not the cabin. A remote monastery. His own breath hitched, echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. He was utterly alone. The walls here were rough-hewn stone, damp to the touch, and a faint, cloying smell of decay hung in the air. He pushed through a heavy, rotting wooden door, its hinges groaning like tortured souls, and found himself in a small, circular chamber. This was a crypt. Not for bodies, Reid realized with a fresh wave of revulsion, but for something else entirely. The walls were covered in intricate, disturbing carvings. Reid approached the altar, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air around the book felt heavy, charged with a palpable malevolence. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and found the lock already broken, its corroded mechanism hanging loose. With a shuddering breath, he opened the book. The pages were brittle, parchment yellowed with age, covered in a script he didn't recognize, yet somehow, the meaning bled into his mind. It wasn't words he was reading, but images, sensations, a direct transmission of knowledge, terrifying and complete. He saw the land, ancient and pristine, before the arrival of his ancestors. He saw a guardian, a primal spirit woven into the very fabric of the earth, protecting the sacred ground, the resting place of forgotten souls. Then came his lineage, seeking refuge, seeking prosperity.
They were desperate, driven by famine and war, and they made a pact.
Not with a benevolent deity, but with the guardian, twisting its purpose. They would build their homes, thrive on its land, but in return, the guardian demanded sustenance. Not gold, not offerings of grain, but life. A specific kind of life. The images coalesced into stark clarity, a ritual sacrifice, performed every few generations, a life offered willingly or otherwise, to satiate the corrupted spirit. A conduit, the book seemed to scream into his mind, a vessel of potent life force from the bloodline itself. The prosperity of his family, their very survival, had been bought with the horror of recurring deaths. It was the latest in a long line of failures to fulfill the pact, or perhaps a desperate, final attempt to break free. And now, the entity was starved. It was awakening, its hunger a tangible force that vibrated through the very stones of the crypt. It wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming its due.
And Reid, the last of his direct line, the inheritor, was the next conduit. The entity wasn't a ghost, not a demon in the conventional sense. To appease it, one of his bloodline had to offer themselves, body and soul, to be consumed. To defeat it. The sacrifice wasn't just a life, it was the end of the line. A low growl, deeper and more resonant than any sound he'd heard, vibrated through the flagstones, a sound that emanated from the very earth beneath his feet. The entity knew he had found its secrets. It was coming for him. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Yet, even as the walls of the remote monastery began to blur, twisting back into the familiar, yet now infinitely more terrifying, timbers of the cabin, he knew there was no escaping what he had learned. The cabin awaited him, hungry, and armed with this horrifying understanding. Reid knew his fight had only just begun. The stakes had never been higher. He understood now. The pact wasn't merely an agreement, it was a tether, binding not just the land but the bloodline, and the entity was merely the enforcement, the hunger given form. The journal, brittle pages yellowed with age, had laid bare the horrifying truth: the ancestor had sought power, a twisted bargain struck at the edge of life and death, facilitated by obscure rites practiced by an isolated sect from a remote monastery, long since abandoned. The cost? A life, generation after generation, culminating in a final, all-consuming sacrifice. Reid clenched his jaw. He was the last. The tremor intensified, a low groan emanating from the cabin's very foundations. Dust motes danced in the dim light, illuminated by the single oil lamp he had lit, a fragile beacon against the encroaching gloom. He had no choice but to break the chain. The journal detailed a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble involving not another life, but a severance, a symbolic dismantling of the original pact's foundations. It spoke of a specific sigil, drawn in ashen blood, and a chant, a series of guttural syllables meant to unravel what had been woven. From his pack, he pulled a small, tarnished silver dagger he'd found tucked away in a hidden compartment of his relative's old desk. He also retrieved a small pouch of dried herbs and a chunk of obsidian, both mentioned in the journal as components for the ritual. The floorboards beneath his boots began to buckle, groaning like tormented timber. A thin, reedy wail rose from the corners of the room, a sound that seemed to scrape against his eardrums, threatening to unravel his sanity. He ignored it, focusing on the instructions, the precise lines and curves of the sigil. He swept a patch of the dusty floor clear, then used the obsidian to scratch out the rough outline of the symbol. He uncapped a small vial of his own blood, drawn moments before with the silver dagger, its keen edge a brief,
sharp sting. He dribbled the crimson liquid into a small bowl of ash he'd prepared from the cabin's hearth. As he began to trace the sigil on the floor, using a finger dipped in the grim concoction, the cabin retaliated. The walls pulsed, no longer merely rippling, but expanding and contracting as if the very logs were breathing. They didn't have clear shapes, but Reid felt their presence, a suffocating weight of ancient malice and insatiable hunger. A guttural growl vibrated through the floor, rising from beneath the cabin, shaking the very bones of the structure. Reid gritted his teeth, his hand trembling slightly, but he continued to draw, his focus absolute. Now, the chant. The journal had emphasized the precise pronunciation, the rhythm, the intent. He took a deep breath, the air thick and rank, and began to speak the foreign syllables. As the first phrase left his lips, a deafening crack split the air. One of the main support beams, groaning under an unseen pressure, splintered with a sound like a gunshot. Splinters of wood exploded outwards. The ceiling sagged visibly. It was a towering, skeletal outline, wreathed in tendrils of black smoke that seemed to drink the light. Its presence was a crushing weight, a vacuum of warmth and hope. It had no eyes, but he felt its gaze, a searing pressure on his soul. He felt the overwhelming urge to drop the journal, to flee, to simply curl into a ball and surrender to the creeping madness. But then, he remembered the pact, the endless cycle, the silent screams of generations. He pushed back, drawing on a reserve of primal defiance he hadn't known he possessed. He would not be another link in their chain. He would not be the final sacrifice. He forced the next phrase of the chant from his lips, his voice raw, defiant against the entity's silent roar of fury. Fractura sanguis, fractura spiritus. The cabin shuddered violently, as if caught in the grip of a giant hand. Reid stumbled back, but his gaze remained fixed on the sigil, on the journal open to the final lines of the counter-ritual. He had to finish it. He would finish it. The rough-hewn bench offered little comfort, its cold stone seeping into Reid's bones despite the thick, scratchy wool blanket draped over his shoulders. He sat hunched in the austere chamber of the remote monastery, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and wood smoke. Outside, the wind, unburdened by the forest's canopy, howled with a mournful, relentless cry, echoing the tempest that still raged within him. His head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes, and the tremor in his hands was a constant, unwelcome companion. He remembered the lunge, the smoky form blurring, a wave of pure, concentrated dread. Beyond that, a chasm. A blank, terrifying void. He'd stumbled out of the forest, bleeding and disoriented, the first light of dawn painting the eastern sky a bruised purple, and collapsed at the monastery gates. He was grateful for it, for the absence of probing eyes or sympathetic murmurs. He couldn't have explained even if he'd wanted to. His fingers traced the ridge of an old scar on his forearm, a jagged, raised line that hadn't been there before. It pulsed with a faint, internal heat, sometimes, a phantom echo of the malevolence he'd faced. It was the only physical testament to the cost of that night, though the deeper wounds were invisible. He'd wake with a gasp, his skin clammy, the taste of ash in his mouth. He hadn't saved the journal. The sigil, too, was gone, torn from its page, perhaps consumed alongside the ancient texts. He'd risked everything for answers, for a weapon, and in the end, he'd lost both. The cabin. He pictured it in his mind's eye, not as it was when he first arrived, but as he'd left it, a ruin. The front door had hung by a single hinge, splintered wood resembling broken teeth. The windows were shattered, gaping holes that let the wind whistle through. The porch sagged, and the roof had partially caved in, exposing the skeletal rafters to the sky. It looked spent, as if the entity, in its final, desperate throes, had torn at its own cage. But was it truly gone? It was like the scent of smoke after a fire, the pervasive reminder that something had burned, something had been there. It had been driven back, repelled, perhaps weakened, but not eradicated. The true cost, he understood now, wasn't just the physical mark or the fractured memories. It was the indelible imprint left upon his perception of the world. The mundane no longer felt safe. He felt perpetually observed, an unseen gaze following him, even here, within the thick stone walls of the remote monastery. The horror hadn't merely occupied the cabin, it had seeped into him, becoming a part of his internal landscape. The entity was ancient, tied to the land, to his very bloodline. It was a predator whose hunger had been temporarily sated, but never truly extinguished. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. He had survived the immediate confrontation, but the war, he knew, was far from over. He was marked, burdened with a knowledge that isolated him, destined to carry the weight of what he'd witnessed. And a new, terrifying question formed in his mind: if the cabin was a ruin, and the entity still lingered, where would it seek its next foothold? The answer, he suspected, might be closer than he dared to imagine. He gripped the rough wool blanket, his knuckles white, a grim determination hardening his gaze. He had faced it once. He would face it again. Outside, the wind, unbroken for days, had finally died, leaving a profound, almost oppressive stillness. He watched the last embers in the hearth, their faint glow painting the rough walls with a flickering, ghostly dance. The elder, a figure of quiet authority, had left him alone with the weight of the revelations. Reid understood now. The pact wasn't merely a promise of land or protection. It was a blood tithe, a generations-long agreement to house a malevolent hunger, to keep it dormant with sacrifice, or risk its full awakening. His distant relative, the cabin's last occupant, hadn't just died, he had become the final, unwilling offering in a cycle Reid had unknowingly inherited. The entity, ancient and boundless, had tasted freedom, however brief, through the fissure of that death. The ritual, a stark, draining affair performed under the watchful eyes of the monastery's inhabitants, hadn't vanquished the entity. It had merely severed the immediate, binding link to his bloodline, to the cabin itself. The elder had been clear: it is pushed back, not destroyed. Its hunger remains, but its tether to you is broken. You are free, for now. The words echoed in Reid's mind, a cold comfort. He was free, yes, but the knowledge, the indelible impression of that ancient malevolence, had etched itself onto his very soul. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, deliberate passage through a landscape that now seemed utterly alien. The forest, once a place of quiet solitude, hummed with a different kind of life, a watchful sentience he couldn't unsee. He reached the cabin at dusk, its silhouette stark against the bruised sky. It no longer felt like a home, not even a cursed one. It was a husk, a monument to a terrible history. The air inside was still, stagnant, yet he could almost taste the faint, metallic tang that had permeated its walls during the worst of his ordeal. He moved through the rooms with a strange detachment, gathering the few belongings he truly valued. The worn leather-bound journal he'd found, filled with his relative's frantic scrawl, he left on the rough-hewn table, a silent testament to the horror that had consumed a life.
He didn't want its words following him, its desperation clinging to his new, fragile peace.
Before he left, he stood in the doorway, gazing at the empty hearth, the silent corners. He didn't feel relief, not truly. He didn't look back as he pulled the door shut, the creak of the wood a final, mournful sigh. The cabin stood, silent and menacing, awaiting its next unwitting visitor, its true purpose now clear to Reid.
Weeks bled into months.
Reid found a new place, far from the forgotten forest, a small apartment in a city where the noise and relentless movement were a welcome, if sometimes overwhelming, distraction. He sought the mundane, the predictable. He worked, he ate, he slept. Yet, the world had fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. He found himself checking the locks on his door multiple times before bed, not out of habit, but from a deep-seated apprehension that something, unseen and unheard by others, might still find a way in. One evening, while unpacking a box he'd forgotten, his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth beneath a stack of old books.
He didn't remember packing it. He'd never seen it before.
It was not from the cabin, not from any of his possessions. A feather-light touch, a subtle whisper at the edge of his hearing, seemed to promise that the resolution he'd sought was merely a pause, and the shadows he'd fought so hard to escape had, perhaps, simply learned to follow.